You're on a train hurtling toward a new life, a new family, a man you've never met. You're leaving behind a city of whispers and shame, running toward a horizon you can only pray is kinder. But packed away in your luggage, nestled between your hopes and your fears is a secret. A secret so profound, so devastating, that if the man waiting for you ever found out, it wouldn't just break his heart. It would shatter his entire world, destroy the lives of 6 innocent children, and prove that you were never the person you claimed to be. This is the story of Margaret Sullivan, a mail-order bride whose journey into the heart of the American West was built on a single, catastrophic lie. And what she didn't know was that her secret was nothing compared to the one the town of Cedar Ridge was already keeping. The autumn wind of 1889 didn't just whip through Margaret Sullivan's dark hair. It felt like it was trying to claw the secrets right out of her. She stood on that train platform in Denver, Colorado, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of a worn leather suitcase. Inside that suitcase was everything she owned. But in her heart, she carried the lie that owned her. At 26, she was an outcast, a scandal in the high society of Boston. So she'd answered an advertisement. A mail-order bride traveling 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, a rancher named Thomas Garrett, a man with 6 children who had already lost their parents. He needed a mother for his fractured family, a good, whole woman to make them complete again. He had no idea he was getting Margaret instead. Hidden beneath her carefully worded letters, beneath the elegant penmanship that spoke of a good education, was the one truth that had sent her running. The one thing that made her hands tremble every time she looked at his photograph. She could be a wife to him, she could be a mother to his children, but she could never, ever give him a child of their own. She was broken, and she was about to build a new life on that broken foundation. Just 3 years earlier, her world had been perfect. She was engaged to Charles Pianton, a rising lawyer from a family as old and respected as Boston itself. The wedding was planned for the spring. The invitations were printed. Her mother's silk dress was being altered. And then came the appointment with Dr. Whitmore. The words he spoke didn't just echo in her mind. They were carved there. "I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan. The complications from the fever, the damage is permanent, irreversible." She had found the courage to tell Charles, believing their love was strong enough to withstand any truth. She was wrong. He wasn't just swift. He was merciless. He broke the engagement within a week, telling their friends it was a matter of fundamental incompatibilities. But in private, his words were like a branding iron. "I need a wife who can give me heirs, Margaret, a woman who can fulfill her duty." The shame was a physical thing, a heavy cloak she couldn't take off. Her mother took to her bed for weeks, wailing that the disgrace would be the death of her. Her father, a cold, stern banker, barely spoke a word to her for months. The silence in their Beacon Hill mansion was louder than any argument. Boston society, a place that thrived on scandal, had found its new favorite subject. Friends crossed the street to avoid her. Invitations stopped arriving. Men, once so eager for her company, now looked through her as if she were a ghost. She was damaged goods. A woman who had failed at the one thing she was put on this earth to do. It was Mrs. Adelaide Crowley, the kind elderly widow who ran the boarding house where Margaret had fled, who showed her the newspaper. "Look here, dear," she'd said, her finger tracing the small print in the Rocky Mountain News. "A rancher in Wyoming lost his wife, raising 6 of his brother's children on his own. He needs help, a good woman to care for the little ones." The ad was simple, honest. Thomas Garrett, 34, owner of a cattle ranch. He needed a wife to help raise his deceased brother's children. He never once mentioned wanting more of his own. His focus was entirely on the 6 orphans already in his care. That small detail was the hook. It was the sliver of hope she clung to. For weeks, Margaret carried that newspaper clipping, reading it until the words blurred. Finally, she wrote. She emphasized her teaching experience, her skills in running a household, her genuine love for children. She was honest about her education, her background, her reasons for wanting to leave the city. But she said nothing about the one thing that mattered most. How do you write the words, "I am barren," in a letter to a man you're hoping will save you? Some truths were too heavy for paper and ink. His reply came faster than she'd expected, his handwriting firm and clear. He asked practical questions. Could she cook for a large family? Was she prepared for the isolation of ranch life? His letters painted a picture of a man drowning in responsibility but determined to stay afloat for the sake of the children. Over 6 months, their letters became the lifeline she clung to. He wrote about the ranch, a sprawling 1,500 acres nestled in a valley. He wrote about the sturdy log house his brother had built with his own hands. And he wrote about the children, each one a universe of personality and pain. Sarah, the oldest at 14, who had become a mother overnight. The 10-year-old twins, Michael and Matthew, wild and full of a grief they didn't know how to express. Rebecca, 8 years old, who still woke up screaming from nightmares about the influenza that took her parents. 5-year-old Emma, who had barely spoken a word since the tragedy. And baby James, just 18 months old, the one spark of uncomplicated joy in a house full of sorrow. Margaret found herself falling in love, not just with the idea of a new life, but with these children she'd never met. She offered advice from her teaching days, suggesting ways to help Rebecca with her nightmares and games to channel the twins' energy. His letters became warmer, addressing her as "Dear Margaret." He confessed his loneliness, the fear that he was failing them every single day. His vulnerability cracked open something in her heart, and she wrote back with an honesty that surprised her, telling him of her own isolation, her feeling of being adrift. When the proposal came, it was just like him, straightforward and practical. He believed they could build a good life. He thought she would be a blessing to the children. He sent money for her train ticket. She accepted without a moment's hesitation, her heart a frantic drum of terror and hope. She sold what little she had, bought practical dresses and sturdy boots, and endured one last, painful goodbye with her parents. Her mother wept, predicting she'd be killed by wild animals or frozen in a blizzard. Her father was simply cold, telling her she was throwing away her life on a fantasy. Neither of them even mentioned a wedding. Only Mrs. Crowley was there to see her off, pressing a small bag of tea and biscuits into her hand. "You're braver than you think," the old woman whispered. And now, standing on that platform in Denver, with the last leg of her journey just hours away, the full weight of her decision crashed down on her. She was about to marry a man she knew only from letters, to become a mother to 6 grieving children, and she was doing it all on a bed of lies. The whistle of the approaching train screamed, and Margaret straightened her shoulders. She picked up her suitcase. In her purse, tucked beside Thomas's letters, was the business card of Dr. Whitmore, a crisp, rectangular reminder of the truth she couldn't outrun. She stepped onto the train, whispering a prayer that when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't burn everything she hoped to build to the ground. She didn't realize the fire had already started. The train ride to Cedar Ridge was like climbing into another world. The mountains rose up like jagged teeth against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. This wasn't the gentle, rolling landscape of the East. This was a place of sharp edges and vast, empty spaces. When the conductor finally called out Cedar Ridge, Margaret's heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. The town was little more than a single dusty street, a collection of wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the immense wilderness. And then she saw him, Thomas Garrett. He was taller than his photo suggested, with shoulders made broad by years of hard work. There was gray in his hair, and the lines around his blue eyes spoke of a sorrow that ran deep. But when he smiled, it was genuine, and it eased a fraction of the tightness in her chest. "Miss Sullivan, I presume," he said, his voice deeper than she'd imagined. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge." He took her suitcase, his hands calloused, but his touch gentle. As they drove the wagon toward the ranch, he pointed out the town's landmarks with a quiet pride. Morrison's General Store, the schoolhouse, and a neat white building with a painted sign, Dr. Helen Blackwood, physician. "Dr. Blackwood's a remarkable woman," Thomas said, a note of real respect in his voice. "Came here from Philadelphia 5 years back. Folks were skeptical about a woman doctor, but she's proven herself 10 times over." Margaret filed the information away. A woman doctor. Perhaps this place was more forward-thinking than she'd hoped. The ranch was 40 minutes out of town, a sprawling expanse of land that seemed to go on forever. As they crested a final hill, the ranch house came into view. It was a sturdy, welcoming log home, with smoke curling from the chimney. And then the front door burst open. The children spilled onto the porch, a chaotic tumble of arms and legs. She saw them just as Thomas had described them. Sarah, 14, holding baby James on her hip, her expression cautious, her eyes holding a wisdom far beyond her years. The twins, Michael and Matthew, bouncing on their toes, their freckled faces a mixture of excitement and suspicion. Rebecca, 8, hiding behind the doorframe, clutching a piece of paper. And little Emma, 5, sitting silently on the steps, her dark eyes watching Margaret with an unnerving intensity. Baby James babbled and reached for her, his innocence a stark contrast to the guarded expressions of his siblings. "Children," Thomas said, his voice gentle. "This is Miss Margaret Sullivan." Sarah stepped forward, her handshake as formal as a queen's. "Welcome to our home, Miss Sullivan." The twins mumbled a greeting, their eyes darting from Margaret to their father and back again. Rebecca shyly thrust the drawing into Margaret's hand. It was a picture of a house with 7 stick figures holding hands. At the bottom, in careful childish letters, it said, "Welcome home." The simple words were a punch to the gut. Home. It was the very thing she'd been running from, the thing she believed she'd never have again. And then she saw Emma, still sitting, still silent, still watching. Margaret knelt down slowly. "Those are lovely flowers, Emma." The little girl just stared, her expression unreadable. She held out the wilted bouquet in her tiny hand. Margaret took them as if they were the rarest orchids. "Thank you," she said softly. "They're the most beautiful flowers I've ever received." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Emma's face, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. The tour of the house was led by Sarah, who pointed out each room with a stiff formality. The house was clean, well kept, but it lacked a woman's touch. It was a house run on necessity, not on comfort. Margaret could see 100 small things she could do to make it a home. That night at dinner, the cracks began to show. The children were polite, but there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't quite place. Sarah answered her questions in monosyllables. The twins whispered to each other, occasionally shooting her dark looks. Only Rebecca and James seemed genuinely happy she was there. Emma ate in her usual silence, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Later, after the children were in bed, she sat with Thomas on the porch. The Wyoming sky was a blanket of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "They're wonderful children," she said, the words feeling thin and inadequate. "They're scared," Thomas replied, his voice heavy. "They've lost so much. They're afraid of losing more." He paused, staring out into the darkness. "There's something else you should know, Margaret. I wasn't entirely truthful in my letters." A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. "What is it?" "My brother's will," he said, his voice low. "It has a condition, a cruel one. He stipulated that I must be married within 2 years of his and Catherine's death to retain guardianship of the children. If I'm not, they'll be sent to live with his wife's cousin in St. Louis, a man named Silas Croft. He doesn't want the children, Margaret. He wants the ranch." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience. It was a race against time. "When is the deadline?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Thomas turned to look at her, his face grim in the starlight. "Next week. The wedding has to be on Saturday. There's no other choice." The pressure was immense, but it was Sarah's words that chilled her to the bone. As Margaret was heading to her room, the girl was waiting for her in the hallway, her arms crossed, her young face set like stone. "I know why you're really here," Sarah said, her voice low and full of contempt. "You think you can fool my father, but you can't fool me. We don't want you here, and I'll do whatever it takes to get rid of you." The girl's eyes were filled with a cold, hard certainty. Margaret realized with a jolt that the children weren't just grieving, they were hostile, and their 14-year-old leader had just declared war. The next few days were a tightrope walk over a canyon of tension. On the surface, Margaret was the picture of a patient, caring bride-to-be. She helped in the kitchen, offered to read to the younger children, and listened politely to Thomas's plans for the ranch. But underneath, it was a battle of wills. Sarah was her shadow, watching her every move with narrowed, suspicious eyes. The twins seemed to take their cues from their older sister. Accidentally, spilling a bucket of muddy water on the floor Margaret had just scrubbed, or letting one of the chickens loose in the house. It was a campaign of small sabotages designed to make her look incompetent and unwelcome. Margaret tried to connect with Sarah to break through the wall of ice, but every attempt was rebuffed. "You don't have to pretend you care about us," Sarah said coolly one afternoon when Margaret offered to help her with the mending. "We know this is just a business arrangement for you." The accusation stung, but it was the "we" that hurt the most. Sarah had turned the others against her. Well, not all of them. Rebecca still sought her out, showing her a new smooth stone she'd found by the creek. Emma would silently appear at her side, offering her a feather or a brightly colored leaf. And baby James still gurgled with delight whenever she picked him up. They were her only allies in this silent, hostile house. The real test came on Wednesday. Thomas had ridden out to check on a distant herd, leaving Margaret alone with the children. She was in the kitchen preparing a stew for dinner when she noticed her mother's gold locket, a precious keepsake she always wore, was gone from her neck. She searched her room, the kitchen, her pockets, but it was nowhere. A cold dread settled in her stomach. When she asked the children, the twins just shrugged, their faces a mask of innocence. Rebecca looked genuinely concerned. Sarah, however, looked triumphant. "Maybe you lost it," she suggested, her voice laced with false sweetness. "You city people are so careless with your things." Later that afternoon, Thomas returned to find the house in chaos. The stew had burned on the stove while Margaret was searching, filling the kitchen with acrid smoke. Baby James was crying, and the twins were having a loud argument in the yard. Sarah met him on the porch, her face a mask of weary responsibility. "I'm sorry, Papa," she said, loud enough for Margaret to hear from the kitchen. "I tried to help, but Miss Sullivan, she just got overwhelmed." Thomas found Margaret by the stove, scrubbing the blackened pot with tears of frustration in her eyes. "Margaret," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "what happened here?" Before she could explain, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Papa, look what I found in Michael's pocket." She opened her hand. Lying in her palm was Margaret's gold locket. "He said he found it on the floor in her room," Sarah said, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "He was just going to give it back." The lie was so blatant, so perfectly executed, that Margaret was speechless. Michael stood behind his sister, looking at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. She had been framed. This wasn't just childish mischief. It was calculated and cruel. She looked at Thomas, expecting to see disappointment, anger, anything. Instead, his eyes were filled with a deep, weary sadness. He knew exactly what was happening. That evening, after the children were in bed, he found her on the porch. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said. "Sarah is kind of protective. She's terrified of another woman coming here and trying to replace her mother. She's afraid of being hurt again." "She thinks I'm here to hurt you," Margaret said softly. "She thinks I'm a fortune hunter after the ranch." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She doesn't understand the danger we're in. She doesn't understand what Silas Croft is capable of." He explained that Croft had already sent a lawyer to Cedar Ridge, making inquiries, challenging the terms of the will. "He's just waiting for a reason to claim I'm an unfit guardian," Thomas said, his voice grim. "A chaotic household, a fiancé who can't manage the children. That's exactly the kind of ammunition he's looking for. That's why this wedding has to be perfect. We have to look like a stable, happy family, even if we're not." The pressure was suffocating. She wasn't just marrying a stranger. She was performing a role in a high-stakes play, and the futures of 6 children depended on her not missing a single line. The next day, she rode into town with Thomas to meet the minister and make the final arrangements. It was there, in the general store, that she met Dr. Helen Blackwood. The doctor was exactly as Thomas had described her: confident, intelligent, with sharp, perceptive eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "So you're the brave woman from Boston," Dr. Blackwood said with a warm smile. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge. It's a challenging place, but a good one." They chatted for a few minutes about Boston, about the challenges of frontier life. It was all perfectly pleasant. But as Margaret turned to leave, Dr. Blackwood said something that made the blood freeze in her veins. "It's a small world. You mentioned Beacon Hill. I did some of my training at Boston General. I wonder if you ever crossed paths with a Dr. Whitmore? I always admired his research on the long-term complications of scarlet fever. Margaret froze, her back to the doctor. She could feel Dr. Blackwood's intelligent eyes on her. She forced herself to turn, to smile, to say something non-committal. The name sounds familiar, but I can't say I knew him. The lie felt clumsy and obvious. Dr. Blackwood just smiled, but her eyes were sharp, analytical. It wasn't a look of suspicion. It was a look of diagnosis. In that moment, Margaret knew. The doctor didn't just know the name. She knew the work. And she was looking at a woman who was a walking case study. Her secret wasn't safe. She was trapped. On one side was Silas Croft and his lawyer, waiting to tear the family apart. On the other was Sarah, determined to sabotage her from within. And now there was Dr. Blackwood, a woman of science who could, with a single, well-placed question, expose the lie that held Margaret's entire future together. The wedding was in 2 days. It was no longer just a deadline. It was a ticking bomb. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and bright, but for Margaret, a cold fog of dread had settled deep in her bones. She stood in her small room, looking at the simple blue dress that Mrs. Fletcher, the minister's wife, had helped her sew. It was supposed to be a symbol of a new beginning, but it felt like a costume for the final act of a tragedy. The house was a flurry of nervous energy. The twins, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their Sunday best, practiced their roles as ushers. Rebecca had picked a bouquet of wildflowers, her face a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Emma was a silent, solemn presence, watching everything with her large, dark eyes. Sarah, however, was a storm cloud of quiet fury. She moved through the preparations with a chilling efficiency, her every action a silent protest. Margaret tried to speak to her one last time. "Sarah," she began, finding the girl in the kitchen, "I know you're unhappy about this, but I want you to know, I genuinely care for your father and for all of you." Sarah turned from the stove, her eyes as hard as river stones. "You don't care about us," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "You're a liar. I don't know what your secret is, but I'm going to find out. And when I do, everyone will see you for who you really are." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. At 1 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. A few neighboring ranch families, the Morrisons from the general store, the minister and his wife, and Dr. Blackwood. The doctor's presence felt like a physical weight in the room. Every time Margaret met her gaze, she felt like a specimen under a microscope. The ceremony was to be held in the parlor. Thomas stood by the fireplace with Reverend Fletcher, looking handsome and impossibly nervous. He caught Margaret's eye as she entered the room and gave her a small, reassuring smile. It was a smile of a man who had no idea how fragile their plan truly was. The ceremony began. Reverend Fletcher spoke of family, of commitment, of building a home filled with love. The words were beautiful, but to Margaret they sounded like a eulogy for a dream that was about to die. She could feel Sarah's glare from the front row. She could feel Dr. Blackwood's analytical gaze from the back. She felt like an imposter, a fraud waiting to be exposed. And then, just as Reverend Fletcher was about to ask for the vows, the front door swung open. A man stood there, tall and thin, dressed in an expensive city suit that looked completely out of place on the Wyoming frontier. He had a cruel, pinched face and cold, emotionless eyes. Beside him stood another man, carrying a leather briefcase. "I believe you've reached a point in the proceedings where one is invited to speak now or forever hold their peace," the man said, his voice a condescending drawl. "My name is Silas Croft, and I am here to object to this union." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Thomas stepped forward, his body rigid with anger. "You have no right to be here, Silas." "On the contrary," Croft said, smirking as his lawyer stepped forward, "I have every right. I am here to protect the interests of these children who are being sacrificed for a marriage of convenience, a sham designed solely to secure this property." He turned his cold eyes on Margaret. "Tell me, Miss Sullivan, how long have you known Mr. Garrett? A few weeks? Did you know he was a man of property when you answered his advertisement?" The questions came like machine gun fire. He was trying to rattle her, to expose the practical, almost transactional nature of their arrangement. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Thomas, at the frightened faces of the children. She could feel the wedding, the guardianship, everything slipping through her fingers. Our arrangement is our own business, Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. It is born of mutual respect and a desire to provide a stable home for these children. Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. A stable home? With a woman no one in this town knows? A woman with no family, no history? For all we know, you could be a criminal. A woman with secrets. The word secrets hit her like a physical blow. She glanced at Dr. Blackwood, whose expression was carefully neutral, but whose eyes were sharp with sudden interest. Sarah was staring at her, a look of vindictive triumph on her face. This was it. The moment she had been dreading, the moment the lie would unravel. She had a choice. She could continue to lie, to fight Croft on his own terms, and risk being exposed in an even more humiliating way. Or she could tell the truth, her own truth, and let the pieces fall where they may. She took a deep breath. You are right, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice suddenly clear and steady. I do have a secret. A hush fell over the room. Thomas looked at her, his face a mask of confusion. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. I am not the woman you all think I am, Margaret continued, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the room before landing on Thomas. I came to Cedar Ridge under false pretenses. There is a reason I left Boston, a reason my previous engagement was broken, a reason I can never give Thomas the one thing a man expects from his wife. She looked directly at Thomas, her heart breaking as she prepared to destroy his last hope. Thomas, she said, the words catching in her throat, I can't have children. I'm barren. The marriage you need, the family you want to build, I can't give it to you. The silence in the room was absolute. Silas Croft's jaw dropped, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He had won. He had found the flaw, the lie that would invalidate everything. Sarah's look of triumph faltered, replaced by sheer, stunned confusion. This was not the secret she had expected. Margaret looked at Thomas, expecting to see betrayal, anger, the same cold dismissal she had seen in Charles Pianton's eyes. But he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he did something no one expected. He took a step toward her. I know, he said softly. The two words hung in the air, defying all logic. Silas Croft let out a sputtering laugh. You know, don't be a fool, Garrett. She's just admitted she deceived you. No, Thomas said, his voice ringing with a strange, quiet authority. He never took his eyes off Margaret. She didn't deceive me. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded, worn letter. You see, Mr. Croft, when a man is entrusting the lives of 6 children to a stranger, he takes precautions. He held up the letter. This is a letter from a Dr. Whitmore in Boston. I wrote to him before Margaret even boarded the train. I told him my situation. I asked him to tell me everything he could about the character and health of Miss Margaret Sullivan. He unfolded the letter. He told me about her kindness, her integrity, and yes, he told me about the fever and its permanent effects. Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. He had known. All this time he had known. But why? She whispered. Thomas's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw the true depth of the pain he carried. My first wife, Catherine, he said, his voice thick with emotion, died in childbirth. I almost lost my mind with grief. I swore I would never risk that pain again. When my brother and his wife died, I was given a second chance at a family that was already complete. He looked around the room at the 6 children who were his entire world. I don't need more children, Mr. Croft. I need a mother for the 6 children I already have. I wasn't looking for a womb. I was looking for a heart. I chose Margaret not in spite of her condition, but because of it. She was the one woman in the world I knew I could love, without the fear of losing her the same way I lost Catherine. He turned back to Margaret, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I knew your secret from the very beginning, Margaret. The only thing I didn't know was if you could ever love a broken-down rancher and his 6 chaotic children. That was the only question that ever mattered. The truth settled over the room, stunning everyone into silence. Silas Croft stood there, his mouth agape, his legal challenge utterly destroyed. Sarah's face crumpled, the years of anger and suspicion melting away into a wave of shame and dawning understanding. Dr. Blackwood was smiling, a slow, knowing smile of a doctor who had seen the whole picture all along. Margaret looked at the man standing before her, a man who hadn't just accepted her greatest shame, but had seen it as a gift, a man who had protected her secret even from her. In that moment, the lie that had driven her across a continent died, and in its place, something true and impossibly strong began to grow. The wedding hadn't been saved. It had just truly begun. In the aftermath of the stunning revelation, Silas Croft and his lawyer didn't just retreat, they evaporated, slinking out of the house under the combined weight of the community's glare. The tension in the parlor broke, replaced by a wave of relieved chatter. But for Margaret, the room had narrowed to one person, Thomas. He stood before her, his heart laid bare, his own secret finally revealed. The foundation of their marriage wasn't her deception, it was his quiet, desperate, protective love. The guests, sensing the intimacy of the moment, began to offer their congratulations with a newfound warmth and respect. Mrs. Fletcher dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Dr. Blackwood gave Margaret a look that was pure, unadulterated approval. But it was the children who mattered most. Rebecca and Emma ran to her, wrapping their arms around her waist. The twins, Michael and Matthew, shuffled their feet, looking at her with a new, shy respect in their eyes. Then Sarah approached. The hard mask of anger was gone, replaced by a raw, youthful vulnerability. Tears streamed down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words choked with shame. "I was so wrong. I was so awful to you." Margaret pulled the girl into a hug, a real one, holding her tight as the 14-year-old sobbed against her shoulder. "You were just trying to protect your family," Margaret whispered back. "And you were right. I was keeping a secret. We both were." It was a moment of truce, of forgiveness, the first real brick being laid in the foundation of their new family. Reverend Fletcher, with a broad smile, cleared his throat. "Well," he boomed, "I believe we have some vows to exchange." The rest of the ceremony was a blur of genuine emotion. When Thomas spoke his vows, his voice was thick with the weight of all the truths that now lay between them. And when Margaret spoke hers, the words were not a promise for a future she hoped for, but a statement of a love that was already real, already tested, already true. The kiss that sealed their marriage was not the tentative touch of strangers. It was a kiss of profound relief, of shared burdens, of a future that suddenly felt solid and real. The reception that followed was a true celebration. The small community of Cedar Ridge, having witnessed the raw drama, now embraced Margaret not just as Thomas's wife, but as one of their own. They saw her not as a damaged woman from the city, but as a woman of incredible strength and courage. That night, after the last guest had departed and the children were finally, excitedly, in bed, Margaret and Thomas stood alone in the quiet parlor. The room was filled with the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke. "You knew," she said again, the wonder of it still not quite real. "Why didn't you tell me you knew?" "How could I?" he answered softly, taking her hands in his. "Your secret was your shield, Margaret. It was the armor you wore after being so badly wounded. To tell you I knew would have been to strip you of it before you were ready. I had to wait for you to trust me enough to take it off yourself." His understanding was so complete, so compassionate, it took her breath away. He hadn't just married her. He had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one else ever had. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding. With all the secrets out in the open, the tension in the house dissolved, replaced by a tentative, joyful peace. Sarah, in an effort to atone for her past hostility, became Margaret's most devoted helper, asking questions about Boston, about her teaching, about the life she had left behind. The twins, free from their sister's influence, revealed themselves to be curious, energetic boys who were desperate for a mother's guidance and affection. They began following Margaret around the ranch, proudly showing her their favorite fishing spots and the elaborate forts they had built in the woods. Rebecca blossomed, her shyness giving way to a quiet confidence. She and Margaret spent hours together, drawing the landscape, identifying local plants, and talking about art and books. Emma's transformation was perhaps the most miraculous. The day after the wedding, she followed Margaret out to the chicken coop. As Margaret gathered the eggs, Emma spoke her first full sentence in over 2 years. "Mama Margaret," she said, her voice clear and sweet, "can I help?" From that day on, the floodgates opened. The little girl who had been trapped in silence became a chatterbox, her mind filled with a universe of questions and observations she was finally ready to share. Life settled into a new rhythm, one based on honesty and a shared commitment to healing. Margaret discovered the deep, satisfying joy of motherhood, a joy she thought had been stolen from her forever. She taught Rebecca to paint with watercolors, helped the twins with their schoolwork, and listened to Emma's fantastical stories for hours on end. She discovered a fierce, protective love for these 6 children, a love that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. She also discovered a deep, abiding love for her husband. Theirs was a quiet love, built not on grand romantic gestures, but on the small daily acts of partnership. They were a team, working together to manage the ranch, raise the children, and build a life in the rugged, beautiful Wyoming wilderness. One evening, about a month after the wedding, Dr. Blackwood rode out to the ranch. Baby James had developed a high fever, and Margaret had been up for 2 nights, nursing him with a frantic, desperate fear. Dr. Blackwood examined the child, quickly diagnosing a simple but severe ear infection. She showed Margaret how to administer the medicine and how to brew a willow bark tea to bring down the fever. As they worked together over the fretful child, the doctor looked at Margaret, her expression thoughtful. "You have a gift for this, you know," she said. "You have a healer's hands and a calm head. Have you ever considered studying medicine?" The idea was so foreign, so far beyond the scope of anything she had ever imagined for herself, that Margaret simply stared. "In Boston, a woman like me," she started to say. "This isn't Boston," Dr. Blackwood cut her off gently. "Out here, we can't afford to waste talent. I could teach you. You could be a great help to me and to this whole community." That night, as she sat by James's crib, watching his fever finally break, a new door opened in her mind. She had come to Wyoming believing her life was over, that her purpose had been taken from her. But perhaps her purpose wasn't what she thought it was. Perhaps her inability to create life was what would allow her to dedicate her own life to saving it. She was no longer just a wife and a mother. She was something more, something new, something she had never dared to imagine. The broken woman who had fled across a continent had not only found a home, she had found herself. And her story was just getting started. 2 years passed and the Garrett Ranch was transformed. It wasn't just the new coat of paint on the house or the expanded vegetable garden that Margaret had planted. The real change was in the atmosphere. The home, once steeped in grief and suspicion, was now filled with laughter and a sense of bustling, happy purpose. Margaret had taken Dr. Blackwood's offer to heart. 3 afternoons a week, she rode into town to study and assist at the clinic. She had a natural aptitude for medicine, a steady hand for stitching wounds, and a deep well of compassion that put even the most terrified patients at ease. She learned to set bones, deliver babies, and mix herbal remedies. The community, which had once whispered about the mail-order bride with a mysterious past, now spoke of Dr. Margaret with respect and affection. Her new calling didn't take away from her family, it enriched it. The children were thriving. Sarah, now a mature 16-year-old, had discovered her own passion, teaching. Inspired by Margaret, she had begun assisting at the Cedar Ridge School and was saving money to attend a teacher's college in Denver. The once hostile girl had become Margaret's staunchest ally and confidant. The twins, now 12, had channeled their wild energy into ranch work, becoming their father's capable apprentices. Rebecca's artistic talent had flourished under Margaret's encouragement, her drawings of the Wyoming landscape showing a remarkable skill. And Emma, the silent girl, had become the family's official storyteller, her vivid imagination captivating everyone during the long winter evenings. James, now a sturdy toddler, was the heart of the household, adored by his parents and doted on by his 5 older siblings. The family had become a true unit, their bonds forged not by blood, but by shared experience and a profound hard-won love. Their peaceful existence was shattered one bitter winter afternoon. A blizzard, the worst in a decade, descended on the valley with terrifying speed. Thomas and the twins were out checking on a herd of pregnant cattle miles from the ranch. As the snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets, Margaret knew they were in terrible danger. The hours ticked by. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, piling snow into monstrous drifts against the house. Margaret and the girls kept the fires stoked and prayed. By nightfall, there was still no sign of Thomas and the boys. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Sarah was a pillar of strength, helping to calm the younger children, but Margaret could see the terror in her eyes. At dawn, the blizzard broke. The world was a sea of white, beautiful, and deadly. Margaret knew she couldn't wait any longer. She told Sarah to keep the children safe and warm. Then she saddled two of their strongest horses, packing one with blankets, medical supplies, and hot coffee. Despite Sarah's protests, she rode out into the frozen landscape alone. Finding their tracks was nearly impossible, but Margaret pushed on, driven by a primal fear. After 2 agonizing hours, she found them. They had managed to find shelter in a small rocky outcrop, but they were in bad shape. One of the horses had broken a leg and had to be put down. Matthew had a deep gash on his forehead from a fall, and Thomas was pale and shivering violently, his breathing shallow. He had given his own heavy coat to Michael, who was suffering from the early stages of frostbite on his hands and feet. Margaret's medical training kicked in, pushing back the wave of fear. She worked with a desperate efficiency, cleaning and bandaging Matthew's wound, warming Michael's hands and feet, and forcing hot coffee down both boys' throats. But Thomas was the real worry. His fever was climbing, and he was slipping into delirium. Getting him back to the ranch was a race against death. The journey was a nightmare. Thomas was too weak to ride, so Margaret and the boys had to rig a makeshift travois, taking turns pulling him through the heavy snow. They finally stumbled back to the ranch house late that afternoon, exhausted and half frozen. Dr. Blackwood was snowed in on the other side of the valley. They were on their own. Thomas had pneumonia. Margaret recognized the telltale rattle in his chest immediately. For the next 3 days, she didn't sleep. She used every bit of knowledge she had, brewing potent herbal teas to clear his lungs, applying mustard plasters to his chest, and sitting by his side, spooning broth and water between his chapped lips. The children were her silent, efficient nurses, keeping water hot, washing linens, and praying. On the 3rd night, the crisis came. Thomas's fever spiked, and his breathing became so ragged Margaret was sure she was losing him. She sat by his bed, holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you leave me, Thomas Garrett," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare leave us." She must have drifted off because she was startled awake by a touch on her cheek. Thomas was looking at her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. His fever had broken. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice weak but steady. "We saved each other," she replied, her heart overflowing with a love so powerful it felt like it might break her ribs. In the spring, as the valley came alive with new grass and wildflowers, a letter arrived from Boston. It was from Margaret's father. Her mother had passed away. The letter was stiff and formal, but at the end he had written a short, uncharacteristic note. "Your mother spoke of you in her final days," it read. "She kept the newspaper clipping that announced your marriage. She was proud of you, in her own way." Margaret realized then that she had made her peace with Boston long ago. Her life, her family, her future. It was all here, in this wild, beautiful, unforgiving place. That summer, a circuit judge, traveling through Cedar Ridge, officially finalized Margaret and Thomas's guardianship of the children. Silas Croft had long since given up his claim, and the family was finally legally whole. The judge, an old wise man, looked at the bustling, happy family assembled before him. He looked at Margaret, the city woman who had become a frontier doctor. He looked at Thomas, the quiet rancher whose love had been strong enough to embrace a woman's deepest secret. "In all my years on the bench," the judge said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "I have never seen a family more deserving of the name." He was right. They weren't just a family. They were a testament to the idea that the best families aren't the ones you are born into, but the ones you build with courage, forgiveness, and a love strong enough to weather any storm. If this story of secrets, survival, and the true meaning of family resonated with you, you're going to want to see what we have coming next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because the stories we tell are about the lines people cross and the truths they find on the other side. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single one.